Good evening, everyone. This is Doug Cook, your host for tonight. I'm the Education Events Coordinator for UMass. Along with me is Anna Gilbert-Muhammad, our Food Access and Webinar Coordinator, and Laura Davis, our Certification Assistance Coordinator and Soil Technical Assistance, as well as our Board President. And before we get started, I'd like to thank all of the UMass board and staff who have contributed to the production of this webinar, the 8th in a series of free resiliency skills online gatherings. A big thanks to our sponsors, Dr. Bronner's and Neptune's Harvest. And most importantly, we want to thank you, the viewers and listeners, especially our members who make our education and advocacy work possible. If you find this event useful and inspiring, please become a UMass member or make a donation to support our important work. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our presenters, Laura Davis and Anna Gilbert-Muhammad. Laura is going to start first.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Friday evening for yet another resiliency workshop at UMass. I'm Laura Davis, and I have been with NOFA since about 2011, I suppose, and I have been the Soil Technical Advisor and the Organic Certification Assistance Coordinator over the last 4 or 5 years. And Anna and I are just 2 of about a group of 7 soil geeks that get together once a month at NOFA and talk all things soil. So we're glad that you're here to hear about analyzing your Logan Labs soil test report. Just a little bit about my farm, which is in Hopkinton, Mass. We're at 2 1/4 acres. We are certified organic, and we're low till for the last this is our 4th season not tilling. We do grow vegetables, and we have about 85 farm shares, and we also attend a couple of farmers markets, and we have a high tunnel and a low tunnel and a seedling hoop house. Important to this conversation tonight really is that we've used the Albrecht method since 2011. The Albrecht method is, Albrecht is a soil scientist that lived up until about the 1930s, based in Missouri, and he came up through his research with the ideal soil balancing calculations for growing food. So that's what we use when we analyze your soil test report at UMass. And we currently grow about 30,000 pounds of produce. So if we talk about soil testing, it's one of those things that gives you some information about what's going on in your soil. So don't shoot in the dark, get a soil test so you know what your limiting factors are. And your limiting factors are really those minerals that are not at the level they should be to support a crop. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, those are some of your main ones that need to be at certain levels. And we also recommend you do soil testing the same time each year. Whether you're doing it in the spring or the fall, just do it the same time each year. I generally do mine in August or September so that I can put amendments on in the fall. Soil testing, you could get a soil test from Logan Labs, and you can get one from UMass Amherst. You can't compare them because they're completely different analyses and techniques for analyzing the minerals in the soil. So once you're using one, you want to stick to that particular soil test. You can't compare the two. Some farmers will use both because they like the phosphorus reading that comes from the type of test that UMass Amherst does. The test that they're doing is a little bit less aggressive than the MELIC 3 that Logan Lab uses. And so the phosphorus level is actually more accurate on the UMass Amherst test. UMass Amherst doesn't always give us all the trace mineral testing that we look for. So generally when we're going to do a a soil test analysis, we want to look at a Logan Labs test. We're trained in such a way to use the Albrecht method that we really can't use with the UMass Amherst test. Another type of test that some people like to get is a saturated paste test, which is more of a short-term type of result that you're going to get. So if you need to know what's going on in your soil, right now within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, saturated paste is often a secondary test that will tell you what's in your checking account, whereas the other tests are more like your savings account, what you have in reserves. So this is a Logan Labs soil test report, and it says AEA only because I too use a soil technical advisor because they actually can look at tissue testing and let us know what's going on. It's another way to read what's going on in your soil is by testing your plants. So the two areas that I really want to hone in on here is the total exchange capacity right up here on the report. It'll say TEC or CEC on your report. And the other item is the organic matter percentage. So the total exchange capacity we'll talk about, and then we'll talk about organic matter. The way that Logan Labs organizes these reports is they put all of the major minerals up on top or what we call exchangeable cations and anions. So these are the major minerals that we want to focus on first. And these percentages here of these major minerals will also give us some indication of what we want to look towards to be in line or balanced with our soil contents. Okay, down below here we have the micronutrients, and these actually are just a few of the trace elements that we look for: boron, iron, manganese, copper, zinc. Some tests that Logan Labs would also give you: cobalt, molybdenum, silica, and others that you can test for. Okay, so let's think about the total exchange capacity. And in your mind, you want to think about this in this way: that if you have a high TEC, and if you remember back, mine was about 6 or 7, which is not a particularly high TEC. So what we talk about with the total exchange capacity is the capacity of your soil to hold on to various minerals. So if you think about the soil colloid, which is the brown circle underneath, soil and carbon have a lot of these negative charges on them, and the negative charges are what holds on to your major minerals like calcium and magnesium and potassium and sodium. And you have more of those negative exchanges on humus or high TEC soil. And you have a lot less of the negative charges on sand, low TEC soil, so all the way to the right. So this is a spectrum of different types of soil, from high TEC or total exchange capacity to low TEC exchange capacity. And you'll notice what a difference is in the amount of calcium and the major minerals that you can have as your TEC is higher, and how little you have when it's lower. So what does that mean to you in your practice of gardening? It means that your soil is, if it's a low TEC, is not going to hold on to the minerals. And so through the growing season, you may have to apply minerals 2 or 3 times throughout the growing season in order for your plants to have enough of those. So that's important to realize, that that if you have lots of exchange sites on your soil colloid, they're going to hold on to many more minerals and be there and available for your plants. And so if you think about a very high TEC, I've not seen anything on the 60, but I've seen them more in the 24 range to be very, very high. And I have seen very low ones as well. And the way this TEC correlates to organic matter is that the very high TEC also tends to correlate with high organic matter in soils. Higher organic matters are going to be more fertile. They generally have more humus, and they also hold more mineral and they hold more water. The opposite is true for low TEC soils. So they tend to be more sandy, the minerals leach away, and the water runs out quickly. So what is organic matter? Well, the definition of organic matter is, this particular definition is from Vern Gerbinger from Vermont. He always talked about the living, the dead, and the very dead. That's what organic matter is about. So the living being plant residues and living microbial mass, the dead being active soil organic matter or detritus, and the very dead meaning stable soil organic matter, often referred to as humus. So what's our target? Our target for organic matter is at least 5%. But in cooler climates, we like to see them much higher than that, up around 8 or 9%. So the impact if you have higher organic matter is really that you're going to not only increase your water holding capacity. Each 1% of your organic matter can hold about 16,500 gallons of water per acre to about 1 feet deep. So it's a tremendous amount of water holding capacity for every percentage you're able to grow your organic matter percentage. And as that organic matter percentage goes up, it increases your exchange capacity and the nutrient holding capacity. You'll also find as your organic matter goes up that your soil tilth and your structure also improve, and you reduce compaction. So these are some of the benefits of having higher organic matter, and these are things that you can notice on your soil report. As you go up in percentage of nitrogen too, your soil will give you an amount of nitrogen in the spring that comes from Mother Nature. So it's let's just say my organic matter is 6%, and I have irrigation. So I usually use about 15 pounds per acre per percentage point of organic matter. So 6% times 15 is about 90 pounds per acre of nitrogen that Mother Nature gives me automatically in the spring because of my organic matter. Now, I'd like to have that a lot higher. I'd love to have my organic matter closer to 9 or 10%, so that I could have more nitrogen to feed a crop. It'd be about 135 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And then I would not need to add any organic nitrogen sources. I would have enough to grow, almost have enough to grow tomatoes and potatoes that need probably the highest amount of nitrogen. So that's another benefit of having a higher organic matter percentage. And it's also the increase in organic matter is going to give us a greater crop resilience and more carbon cycling and sequestration if we have enough photosynthesis going on. So how do we build the organic matter? That's really the key part, is that cover crops, people are sometimes challenged to get cover crops in when they're growing into October, November. But cover crops can be undersown under kale, and under some of your fall crops. They can be sown in your walking paths, and but you need to start thinking about putting them down in August and through September. Also, reducing tillage and not disturbing the soil will also help build organic matter, and using as much organic mulch as possible to keep the soil covered if it's not got the cover crop on it. So shredded leaves, hay, and straw are good mulches. We want to keep the soil covered with as many green plants as possible. If not covered with green plants, covered with mulch, and if not your own vegetable plants, then certainly a cover crop covering. These are ways that you can build your organic matter to a higher percentage, and you can also do it by increasing the biology in the soil. The biology is what we like to refer to as little farmers that help us to chew up the organic matter and then cycle those nutrients through into the root zone that are made available to the plants. We also think about using inoculants. So whether we have a seed inoculant or we're using an inoculant at transplant or in the irrigation, those are ways to increase the biology in your soil to help this process. And biostimulants are really just food for some of the good bacteria that you're adding, food for the biology, and often people are foliar spraying or using these in the drench when they're transplanting. So what are we really looking for in terms of the ideal balanced soil for growing vegetables? These are goals. They don't have to be exactly this amount, but this is the amount of calcium between 60 to 68%. If you remember the soil report I showed up front, there were some base saturation percentages on the soil report. If you have calcium that's less than 60% when you get your soil test back, you definitely want to address that up front. The first two things you want to address are calcium and magnesium. Magnesium percentage that you want is between 12 and 20%. And it really just depends on what your magnesium is. If your magnesium comes in at 12%, then your calcium should be about 68. If your magnesium comes back higher, more like 20, then your calcium should be more like 60. So it's a nice balance is what we're doing, a mineral balancing to make sure your soil has what it needs to grow the ideal vegetables. And potassium percentage is between 3 and 6%, sodium between 0.5 and 3%, and free hydrogen can be anywhere from 10 to 15%. And that's not something you add, obviously, it's just part of the test that oftentimes you'll see tests with no hydrogen, and that's okay because all of the exchange sites are taken up by the most important minerals, which are calcium, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, etc. So if the base saturation is balanced within this range of percentages, then the pH will naturally land at the ideal pH for growing vegetables, 6.3 to 6.4. You often hear in conventional agriculture, this search for the meeting the ideal pH. And what Albrecht discovered was that if all of the other minerals that are required are in balance, then the soil pH will naturally land where it's supposed to land. And 6.3 to 6.4 is the ideal pH because that's when all of these minerals above and all the trace elements are most available at that pH. So this really is the Dr. Albrecht's research. If anybody likes to read any of those, there's lots of volumes of his work that you can read, but it's a lot of material. So um, originally, I enjoyed learning about the Albrecht model from the Bionutrient Food Association, um, and uh, then subsequently through many other workshops, learning how to balance soil with this type of technique, the Albrecht model. Okay, so calcium, magnesium, and potassium are calculated on the Logan Labs soil report for you. So they will often tell you how much of each of these you're going to need. The other calculations that, or the other minerals, they do not automatically calculate them on the soil report for you. So the ranges that we're looking for are sulfur. The other thing on the soil report that you may find is that parts per million is one way, one metric that is used, and pounds per acre, PPA, is another metric that is used on the report. The parts per, parts per million times 2 multiplied by 2 equals the pounds per acre. And generally, it's easiest if you convert to pounds per acre first before you try to do any calculations. But these are the amounts that are goals that we're looking for in the ideal growing environment for food, for vegetables specifically. Sulfur, phosphorus, boron, manganese, copper, and zinc. So when we look at the soil report, we're really focusing first on the big minerals, the calcium, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, and phosphorus. We look at them first. Then we really want to focus on the biology and making sure to cover crop. And then lastly, once the major minerals are in place, then one can really start focusing in on the micronutrients. These are very small amounts of micronutrients, but they are elements that people need to be healthy, as well as animals. And so if you are raising animals or vegetables, sometimes, let's say, not having enough boron prevents those beets from sizing up. So these can be very helpful as we're growing vegetables. So granular micronutrients, we generally will mix with carbon sources when we're applying them, just so they have something to hang on to, and they tend to be very small amounts, and it's easier to apply them over a larger area if you can mix it with more volume of material. So we generally say that if you need, a pound of micronutrients, that you're going to add three pounds of compost or biochar or humates in order to apply them to your soil easier. And so that was kind of the way that we learned about soil balancing and about adding minerals and trace elements to the soil. There is a lot of people now using these micronutrients, the trace elements, in foliar sprays, spraying directly on the plant's leaves, because the plant can absorb them into their leaves, and actually have quite a good impact on their growth and their fruiting. So one of the things that you can do is really, learn a lot about how to, read your soil, think about, if you have a very low TEC, you want to make sure that you're applying, some sort of fertilizer 2 or 3 times over the growing season so that your crops have enough to get them through. If you have a higher TEC, then you tend not to have to fertilize as often. And again, you want to make sure that you're focusing on trying to get your organic matter up to a good percentage, at least 5, but closer to 10 would be great. And it's going to give you all sorts of advantages as you focus on those measurements on your soil test. So just as a note, UMass can do these analyses for you if you have a Logan Lab soil report. These soil samples would go directly to Logan Labs, and they would email you a test result, and at which point you could ask one of the soil technical assistance folks at NOFA to give you an amendment recommendation. We generally also give sourcing for the items that you're going to need, a calendar of how to apply and when to apply, and also just some instructions about cover cropping, mulching, inoculants, biostimulants. For those that require it, also a nitrogen calculator. And the great thing about this, the technical assistance role at NOFA, is that we have expert consultation that we can use at these organizations, and sometimes we do get a soil test that stumps us. So we will often consult with the Bionutrient Food Association, Advancing Eco-Agriculture, and we have utilized the training from Kinsey Labs as well. And when we give amendment recommendations, we give amendment recommendations that would also be approved for a certified organic farm. So it wouldn't be products that you should not be afraid to use. And that recommendation is $25 per soil test. And that is the end of my part of the presentation. So I believe now it will be Anna's turn.
As was mentioned before, my name is Anna Gilbert-Muhammad. I am, not only do I work as a food access coordinator and equity director for NOFA Mass, but I do get the wonderful opportunity to work and learn from Laura as a soil technical assistant. And my focus, if you will, is on urban backyard gardens and community gardens in city settings, partly because I'm based in Springfield, and there are a lot of challenges that we face, or differences, I'll use a more positive term, that you don't always see in the rural setting. And it's also smaller. Oftentimes we're working with raised beds, we're working with smaller plots of land. And so some of the fertility that's needed, I wouldn't say necessarily trickier, but it's not at the same scale. And so sometimes it can be easier, sometimes it can be a little bit more challenging, but it works all the same. What I like to always show brand new gardeners and community gardeners who have never been introduced to soil testing or fertility, that this can be done very quickly, very simply, and I hate to use this term on the cheap, if you will, to gain the maximum fertility out of your growing out of your soil. So I'm going to show you, and I hope you can, let me make sure you can see it. The UMass test that we start with. Oops. I'm showing you a test from a parishioner that I worship with, from a 2018 UMass test. And oftentimes, when we're talking about a brand new gardener, whether they're in Springfield or Boston, Philadelphia, our biggest concern is, what is the lead level? And because lead poisoning in soil or even from paint chips is a very detrimental thing to health. So the soil test from UMass, that's the first thing we look for. is what is that soil value? What is that lead value? Is it exceeding the limits that UMass has stated and has put in terms of growing vegetables? And so we get the simplest test that UMass has that's stated slated for home gardeners. And Laura mentioned this before, but they're using a different acid test than Logan Labs. And the Logan Labs test does not depict or give the lead level. So that's why we do start with the UMass test first. And the acid test is different. They are using a modified Morgan test, which is a different acid test than Logan Labs. But looking at this particular test from 2018, the lead levels here were higher than the optimum value. So the way that UMass puts that out, they have an optimum amount for the lead level, and it is in parts per million. They indicate here on the right that the lead level at this time was over their optimum value, which was 22 parts per million. His came in at 29.9 parts per million, so it was elevated. And of course, when you first see something like that, you think you could never, ever, ever grow. And that's not the case. You just have to make some adjustments. And given the area that he was growing in, we decided that would be best to do raised beds in this area. And he had another part of his garden on the other side of the house that actually he could go in ground because it was well below the limits for lead. And there's another webinar that we did earlier with Allison Houghton and Laura Davis as well concerning dealing with urban growing. You can check that out on our YouTube page where we go into that. Once we saw the lead levels, and even before his test came back, I always suggest to people, take a look at the history of your area of where you're going to grow. If you can pull up some kind of information from the city to see what was there before. We did a little research and found that that house actually had it wasn't run by natural gas. It actually had an oil tank there where he wanted to grow. As well as there was some other, there was another industry that was in the site where they built this house in the 1950s. All that led up to seeing this elevated level. So sometimes even before you do the test, if you look into some of the history, some of the elders in the community can tell you, oh, a dry cleaner was there, or a old car dealership was there. That will give you an indication of what you might face. Now, the UMass test, another good thing with this test as well that we will use it for, there's always an issue with phosphorus when you're talking about an urban setting because of the compost and the fertilizer that we're using. And this test, and I'm gonna see if I can scroll down here, on his recommendation and on most of the UMass results that come back, they will tell you in their comment section what some of the adjustments you can make. And so as it reads here, the lead level is elevated and they're giving recommendations as to what he could do. They also recommended taking a secondary test, which total sorbed metals. You don't necessarily need to do that as a home gardener. There are other treatments that you can do without having to take the more expensive test after that. But it does mention how he can correct the nitrogen to supply phosphorus. When my test came back, I had too much phosphorus, so I had to lay off of the compost I was using and some of the fertilizers, and I added more cover crops to make that adjustment. So two of the great things that we use the UMass test for more of an anecdotal, not necessarily from the calculation, but just looking at observations, is the lead level, and then are we looking at excesses in phosphorus. Very quickly, what I call some easy fertility tips. As a new gardener, there are very quick ways that you can add fertility to your soil. So Laura mentioned boron, some of the trace elements like your boron, your more driver, I call them driver nutrients like magnesium and then sometimes sodium. There are ways to use what you may already have in your house to increase that fertility and to get those micronutrients in. And so with boron, we know with plants, it's for fruit development, sometimes plant development. You can go and buy something as simple as 20 mule borax. It is 100% boron. It will not hurt the soil or hurt your plant. It actually will assist in the fruit development. I always like to add stuff like this or this particular item in the soil before I even start planting. I'll massage it in. And he did that when he, this past year or last year, and we found that his boron levels did go up. Also, and this is probably, and this came from Dr. George Washington Carver as it relates to sodium. Sometimes sodium as a trace mineral is needed. You can always add sodium bicarbonate. We know it as baking soda to help lower soil acid. So if you have a high acid level, you can use baking soda to help lower that. And then finally with magnesium, if you need to raise it, and Laura talked a great deal about the importance of calcium and magnesium, Epsom salt is doable to do that. The calculation or the amount you want to use, you never want to overdo it with that. With Epsom salt for a plot that's 4x8, a cup. For a 4x6 or 4x4, a half a cup. If you're adding it to your watering can, because you can also treat it like a foliar, if you will, and you're going to water your plants throughout the season, no more than a tablespoon of Epsom salt to a 2-gallon watering can. And with boron, a half of tablespoon to a 2-gallon watering can. That way you don't burn the leaves of your plants. One of the things that we found working in city soils and working with another project in Boston is that oftentimes your plants will tell you what's happening with them and what's happening with them in the soil. And so this little pictograph we put together with Groundwork Somerville and the trustees at their City Natives garden to show what a new gardener can look for in their plants. Charlie Moore, the former board chair for the American Community Garden Association, often would say in his workshops, talk to your plants. Now, people may think you're strange if you're out there talking to your plants, but what he really meant was use the power of observation that we've been given. Your plants will tell you what they're deficient in. And so this pictograph will show what colors on the leaves of your plants you want to look for if there are some deficiencies. So you know, going back to magnesium again, if the lower leaves of your plants, particularly for your, say your tomatoes and your peppers, are turning yellow from the outside going inward, but the veins of the leaf are very much green, there may be a magnesium deficiency. Or if there's a nitrogen issue, the upper leaves of your plant, they're light green and the lower are yellow, then you could be seeing some issues with nitrogen. And with phosphate, same thing, you have very dark leaves, darker than the rest of your plant. And one that I found very interesting, and I just learned this recently along calcium, looking at some of my tomato plants last season where I was seeing some misshapen leaves or stunted, that was actually a calcium deficiency. And so your plants will talk to you through what you see, through your observations. Lastly, the old folks down south will always say, how does it taste? How does it look? How does it smell? How does it feel or touch? And using that as part of our sensory anecdotal way of testing out what's happening with your soil, it does work. And when we refer to taste, we'll pull off a tomato, pull off a pepper. How does it taste to you? If your tomato is a little tart, then you know you may have some high acidity in your soil. Or if you're if you open up your bell pepper from a plant, you took a sample and it's not fully developed inside, it might be missing something, and that's your observation of sight. So never discount the anecdotal. Sometimes what you taste, what you smell will tell you if there's some adjustments you might need to make. And then always look at the history of where you're going to grow. Anytime someone's talking to me about starting a new garden, we do have a quick conversation with, do you know what was there beforehand? Do you have an idea what if they grew before? if there was any kind of structure that was there. Oftentimes those items will let you know right off the bat if, okay, maybe I don't need to even do the test right now, because as we know with COVID, UMass has closed their labs. So for many of the new gardeners I talk to, we know right off the bat, because of where they're located, the certain parts of the city that I know that they live in, we go right to a raised bed because we know what that test is going to come back and say. And we make the adjustment there. So with that, for those of you who are new gardeners, that is a very quick way of getting fertility into your soil. The most important thing, if you can, I do know that UConn is still taking tests as well as University of Maine. Make sure that we're not having contamination via lead issues. But if you have any concerns right off the bat, go ahead and do a raised bed. It's not a difficult thing to do. So with that being said, I will turn things back over to Doug if there are any questions. My contact information is there as well if you have any questions.
Great, thanks, Anna. And I'm going to start off with some questions that have come in so far. One person asked if you could share a little bit more information about the TEC, specifically a range. What would be too low? What is good? Optimal?
I'm sorry, Doug, you cut out just when you were saying, what was the item?
TEC range was the question. What is too low and what's good?
So if you have a TEC around 10 to 12, that would be really fantastic. If you have it 3-ish, 2-ish, it's low, and you're going to, it's probably really sandy soil too.
Mm-hmm. And we have a few questions about mineral imbalances, in particular phosphorus. For example, one person asked that they're showing excessive phosphorus on their UMass Amherst test. Their soil organic matter is 11.7, and their cation exchange is about 24.5. They apply their own compost and use shredded leaf mulch, and we're wondering if you have any recommendations about how to correct the imbalance.
So I'm guessing that you've been applying compost for more than a few years. We see really high phosphorus levels on gardens that have very high phosphorus levels. And there is such a thing as too much of a good thing when it comes to compost. I'm assuming too that the compost has manure in it. It's not a vegetative compost. And so if it has manure in it, you need to back off on the compost that you're applying. And that means to use compost that hasn't been made with manure for a few years and test it again. Because you run the risk of depending upon your site, of polluting. So we don't want to have too much phosphorus in your soil.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, it sounds like it's really important to add calcium if calcium levels are low. And can I tell from a UMass test if there's not enough calcium in my soil to be balanced, and what should I add if I need more?
I know in the UMass test, they will tell you in the towards the bottom if it's optimum, if it's excessive. When you look at this test I have here, they have it rated very low, low, optimum, above optimum. If it's above optimum, that's where you are going to make your adjustment. And in their comment section, they do give you some idea of what to do. If, and I think this was phosphorus, right, Doug, that you were talking about?
Calcium in particular?
Calcium. Yeah, there are things there. Now I'm going to give you some simple things that you can do to raise it. I know Laura could go more into detail in terms of how to calculate that out. I will add gypsum in the beginning of my season and massage it in. That is a good one. It will get it quickly into the soil. And then as I'm planting, sometimes I will add crushed eggshells in with the seedling to both give that soil the needed calcium, but also the plant. So I give it back to Laura. She could probably give you more of a scientific and detailed way of correcting that.
Gypsum is excellent because most soils also have sulfur deficiency, and gypsum has both calcium and sulfur, so you can knock off two needs with one product. So that's an excellent choice. Another choice, and it also depends upon what your magnesium level is. If your magnesium is too high, you definitely don't want to use a dolomitic lime. But another type of limestone that you could use is called agricultural lime or high calcium lime. So that would be another calcium source. Rock phosphate has some good calcium in it, as well as something we call calphos. And so aragonite is another one that is really high in calcium. So those are some of the items that would give you calcium for your soil.
Great. And we have a couple of questions specifically about when is the best time to do a soil test? When gathering a sample for the soil test, do you recommend taking soil amendments from all area, from amended soil, I'm guessing? And is it useful to use the kind of soil test that you can buy in the gardening centers?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you can take soil tests any time of the year, but just make sure that if you're going to redo them from year to year, that you take it at the same time. But generally, it's nice to be able to get a soil test in August or early September so that you can get your amendments onto your beds before snow flies. And a lot of these minerals will benefit from having them down in the fall. The only thing that we don't apply in the fall is potassium and nitrogen.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the picture of those carbon colloid on the soil and the exchange sites. So potassium doesn't hang on. And neither does nitrogen. It gets rushed through the soil and leaches out. So we don't put those on in the fall. So the time frame would be test in August, September, get your amendments down and your cover crop in or mulches. And then in the spring, when you're opening up your garden, you apply your potassium and a nitrogen source if you need it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to take a sample, it's good to say if you're going to do one bed, take it from different parts of the bed and mix it together. That gives it a good composite of the area. Because sometimes you can take one may be heavy in one area, you may have too much organic matter in the other. But if you mix it together, make sure there's no leaves or grass in it. That gives a very good sample. And it's always good to take the test if you can, same time every year.
Mm-hmm. And one question came in, and Laura, you mentioned leaching in particular. Is there anything that we would add into our gardens that would lock up or bind to phosphorus in high phosphorus soils to make it less likely to run off?
There are plants that can hold up phosphorus. I'm not as an expert about this. I believe there's sunflowers that can pull up some of the extra. Some of the cover crops, certain cover crops can also be a good plant to use to pull out additional phosphorus, and I honestly would have to look up which one that was, unless Carol may know the answer to that question too.
So we're going to skip to a little bit of a different topic for the moment. When basically, why do we try for higher soil organic matter in our colder climates?
The organic matter needs to be a little bit higher for colder climates due to the plants are going to, they need to be more resilient in colder climates, basically. And the higher your organic matter, the more resilient your plants are going to be. Because they're going to be able to have a lot more minerals, water. They will also take to frost better and be more resilient that way. So the heat also plays a factor in the south, so they don't tend to. They have sandier soils. They have so the organic matter can be a little bit less for them.
Yeah, someone asked about crop fatigue in midsummer, and it sounds like that might play a role in it. Are there any other things that in the middle of the summer we should be particularly paying attention to for our crops?
You don't want your soil to dry out. This may seem like an obvious point, but once your soil dries out, or you let it dry out, or you let it get too dry, you're going to be losing some of your biology. Some of your biology will die or go away. So, when I was first starting out my farm, which has only been 10 years ago, I would take pictures of my soil or I would take pictures of my funny looking plants and send them to somebody and say, what's going on here? And they would look at my soil and say, your soil's dried out. So you definitely want to keep the right moisture in your soil. It will really help to maintain the biology that's helping you to grow your plants.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And just to touch on the store-bought soil tests, are those reliable, useful? What do you think about those?
I don't know, Anna, have you ever used them?
I have used one because I was looking for a particular thing. Some, they can be useful. You just want to make sure you read it will tell you what it will test for. There are some store products where it'll give you pH, nothing else. Some that will give you maybe the lead level, which is a good one. But then if you're looking for fertility, you have to do something else. So I always like to read in its entirety before I buy it. What will this product do? What information is it going to give to me? I know at one of the nurseries here in Springfield, they do have a soil test, but it's great if you're planting blueberries, and the pH of the blueberries is very tricky sometimes, and so that test is slated for that, but it will not give you too much in terms of trace minerals and lead levels or contaminates and things like that. It's not made for that. So that's all I can offer on that, is you really want to read the test, research the test, and see. And then it depends on what you're looking for as well, what your needs are.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we have a few questions here about pH. In general, how do you lower pH? Someone asked because they have slightly elevated, it's about 7.8, 7 to 7.8. Their calcium, phosphorus, and sodium are good. Their magnesium is a bit high, it's 24 to 29, and the sulfur is a little bit low on their Logan Lab test.
Yeah, definitely you're going to want to use elemental sulfur, which is 90% sulfur. And you're low on sulfur anyway, it sounds like. So you want to definitely add some of that elemental sulfur, and that will definitely help bring the pH down. And I generally add that in the fall.
Okay. Additionally, someone asked about how to apply carbon with macronutrients?
Okay, so the best thing to use for a small garden is a lawn spreader, if you have one, the type of spreader that you put grass seed down with, and you put the amount of the trace elements that you need, and then let's just say you're using a pound of boron and maybe a quarter pound of zinc. You would want to multiply that by 3 and add 4.5 pounds of carbon. So that would mean 4.5 pounds of compost, or biochar, or humates is another good carbon source. And then you mix it all together with a trowel in your lawn spreader, and then you run it through your garden as you're on your walking paths, and it will spread that for you. That's usually, we have 2.25 acres, and that's exactly how we do it. We use a lawn spreader. We don't have a big tractor.
Mm-hmm. And someone also asked if we can quickly raise pH for blueberries. How do we do that?
I would have to probably look at their soil test to see that. There are these products that you can buy at your garden center that will tell you exactly that. You know, for raising pH. You know, oftentimes people have thought that blueberries need a much higher pH. I think it's not always the case. So if you're, I don't know what your pH is, if you're, you know, are you 5-ish, are you 4-ish, or what is it that you're trying to raise it to?
Yeah, if that comes in, I'll let you know. Another question, sorry, go back to it, was whether we can find out the desired levels, parts per million, for the other trace minerals on the Logan Lab tests, where that might be found.
So there's the standard soil test that Logan will give you that that will test for those first trace elements, which is basically boron, copper, zinc, and manganese. And then they have a different type of test that you can request that will test for additional micronutrients, cobalt, molybdenum, silica, and I know I'm missing one. But they will test for those as well, and those are on the soil report. If you are looking at the soil report, it's on the very bottom of that test.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go with one more question before we wrap up. It's 6:30. Thank you all for staying. And if I'm making a raised bed, what should I fill my raised bed with? And should I put a barrier on beneath it on the original soil? That's
a really good question. If you are living on, have city soils or urban soils that you've tested for lead, a liner is recommended. In the city of Boston, that's required of all urban farms to have a barrier, and then at least 18 inches of growing medium. It's really hard to get the perfect soil when you're not talking about native soils. When you're filling an urban growing area or a raised bed, it's tough to get that soil just the way you want it. I know I did that in my garden, and I'm still working on it almost 20 years later. But I think that you, and Anna, you probably have some good thoughts about this. You want to make mixture of loam and compost, and you may have other things that you would recommend too, right?
Yes, when you're talking about a mixture, and I agree with you, it is something you have to play with a little bit, but you don't want all compost, but you want a nice mixture of some loam, topsoil, um, compost that may have some manure in it. Using cover crops, I tend to use those to undersow under certain crops during the growing season has been very helpful to help bring a good balance. Going back to the barrier, one of the things that's good, and you can go to a webinar, part of the Resilience series that Carol Roselle and Lydia Lyons did on how to put together a raised bed, where they had first a layer of cardboard. And normally when I'm working with raised beds here in Springfield, we will start with some kind of layer, a couple of layers, in fact, between the ground, if you will, and then what they're going to grow in the raised beds. And so I do oftentimes recommend 2 or 3 layers between those sections, so that you're going to be you won't be touching that soil that may have issues. And it's always good to go back and test to make sure there's no leaching that hasn't gotten through the barriers, because things wear out over time. But that's what I can offer in terms of a mixture, is to have a nice mixture of topsoil and compost and maybe some loam.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up here. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. If you found this event inspiring and helpful, please consider becoming a member or making a donation. As well, we want to thank our sponsors, Neptune's Harvest and Dr. Brauners, for helping us continue to deliver these free resiliency skills online gatherings. If you have suggestions about topics that you'd like to see us cover, you can send them to me directly. My email address is Doug, D-O-U-G, @nofamass.org. As well, next Friday, we will have Afton Cyrus, who will help us learn more about getting started with preserves, and in particular, making quick pickles and refrigerator jams, demonstrating how to make a quick brined pickle with an all-purpose brine, and how to make an easy small batch refrigerator jam with whatever fruit you have on hand, and it'll help you preserve your fruit all summer long. Additionally, our summer conference this year is going online, and for the first time, we will be held for 3 weeks, July 20th through June 9th, and it's a celebration of the grassroots organic movement that you can enjoy from your own home. You'll be able to join organic growers, farmsteaders, and enthusiasts this summer for an informative and uplifting virtual event. And you can find more information about that on our website, nofamass.org/events. And with that, again, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next time.